The speaker is Amiran. The talk is Not So Secret, the Hidden Risks of GitHub Actions Secrets. So please give it up for Amiran.
Hello, Forward CloudSec. I'm super excited to be here today. My name is Amiran Alavidze. I'm Director of Security Engineering at Zello. We build push-to-talk voice solution for frontline workers. And I'm here today to talk about security of GitHub secrets. Our kind of sample scenario here is imagine a small company or a startup that uses GitHub for version control, and they use GitHub Actions for CI/CD workflows. Those workflows obviously require credentials to do anything in their cloud environments. So a first workflow that they might create might look something like this. This is obviously terrible because we have these hard-coded credentials in the workflow, so anybody who looks at this will say, oh, what's happening? Let's get rid of them. And maybe you might decide to use GitHub repository secrets to replace these hard-coded credentials with just references. It's fairly easy to do. You can go into the settings on the repository, go into secrets and variables, and then configure the secrets there. And then your workflow changes slightly, but not by much. So our second workflow that will use those secrets will look something like this. So no more hard-coded credentials. We just reference secrets that we've configured, and the workflow just works. And this can give you an impression that now all of your secrets are well secure, because you cannot view those secrets once you configure them. You cannot view those secrets in the UI. It's just not possible. You can replace them, but not view existing values. And also GitHub Actions, if you accidentally output those secrets as part of the workflow, GitHub Actions will actually mask that output and will not allow you to accidentally leak those secrets in the workflows. Now, having said that, somebody might be viewing GitHub documentation, GitHub hardening documentation, and one of the warnings that they have there is any user with write access to your repository has read access to all the secrets configured in that repository. There's no more details than that, so it's not clear why that's the case, so let's explore this a little bit more. So now imagine I'm an engineer, I have write access to the repository, and what I do is I create a new branch, and I slightly modify this workflow that we had. And instead of the actions that were originally in the workflow, I'll just try to exfiltrate the secrets. Now, what I'll do next is go and basically run this workflow on the new branch that I created. So I select my branch, and I run the workflow. Let's give it half a minute and see what happens. So the workflow executed successfully, and in the output, we can see two things. Firstly, as we expected, if we just tried to output the secrets, GitHub Actions did mask those values. But if you do simple transformation like base64 encode the values in this case, you now have access to the secret values. So again, to repeat this, any user with write access to your repository will have access to those secrets. Now, how common is that you have engineers or people in general that have write access to your repositories? That's pretty common. If you want somebody to contribute code to your repositories, they will have write access. And so one common way to deal with this and kind of strengthen the security model of your source code is you will have branch protection rules, and you will maybe require pull requests and approvals of those pull requests before any changes might be merged into your repository. But my repository has branch protection rules on the default branch, and those branch protection rules do nothing to protect your secrets. And the secrets, what's happening, kind of underlying problem here is that firstly, GitHub Actions workflows are defined in the repository on which they run. Secondly, the workflow definitions are taken from the branch on which the workflow is executed. So if I create a new branch, completely modify the workflow, I can run the modified workflow on that branch that I've created. And thirdly, repository secrets are available to any workflow executions within that repository, which means that that modified, that compromised workflow definition will be able to access the secrets. So a combination of these three things ultimately give anybody with write access to the repo read access to the secrets. So now, what can we do about this? There's a couple of ways of dealing with this problem. One is using what is called environments. Sometimes they're called deployment environments in GitHub documentation. And environments also allow you to configure secrets or variables, but they also allow you to configure protection rules on those environments. And protection rules allow you to control who or what can access those secrets, can use the environment and access those secrets. So let's take a look at that. We'll go into our repository settings again. And I already pre-created this environment that I called production. And I want to show you that there's multiple things that are available in terms of how you can secure the environments. One of the things that I have configured is basically I'm saying this environment can only be used by a workflow that's executed on the main branch, which is my default protected branch. No other branch will be able to use this environment. And now I can basically move those secrets that I had as repository secrets into this environment. So let me do that quickly. By the way, feel free to steal these secrets. All right. In a sense, this looks the same, but because of these protection rules, it acts very differently. So we can now go into the repository settings and delete our repository secrets. We don't need them anymore. They've been replaced by the environment secrets. So this one is gone, and this one is gone. And you can see that for visibility purposes, we see that we do have those secrets that we've configured in the environment kind of listed here as potentially secrets that can be used. Once we've done all of that, our workflow is modified very slightly. It's basically the same workflow. The only change here is that I'm referring to that production environment in my workflow. And now I'm able to use those secrets when this workflow is run. So now let's try and validate whether our previous attack will actually work here. So I have yet another branch that has the malicious actions in the workflow. It still references this production environment. So I'm going to try and execute this workflow using my malicious branch. So that branch was called Shady2. And I'm essentially doing the same thing, but on this new workflow that uses an environment. Give it half a minute again. And now our workflow execution failed because the protection rules of that production environment did not allow you the use of that environment on a non-protected branch. So that's one way to deal with the issue of secrets. Another way to deal with it is for third-party services that support this configuration, we can also use OIDC instead of long-lived credentials, we can use OIDC configuration, trust configuration, and short-lived credentials. So in this case, there's kind of two parts to this. One part is modifying the workflow and basically completely removing the secrets and telling the AWS Actions action to, or configure AWS Credentials action to assume this role that we've pre-configured in AWS. And in AWS, we will have an identity provider that we configure, and we can create this role. So the name of this role was the same, or the ARN of this role was the same as in the workflow. And in the trust policy, we can specify what can assume this role. And so in this case, I wanted to demonstrate that a similar attack is actually possible even if you're using a short-lived OIDC credentials. So in this case, what I'm doing here on the trust policy is I'm essentially saying that any workflow on that repo that I'm using, and this is the star here, this will essentially mean that any workflow in that repository will be able to assume this role. So let's validate that we can still do the same attack against now this short-lived credentials. So I'll take the same modified workflow that uses OIDC, and again, I'll slightly modify it to output the credentials. In this case, we also need the session token, because those are the credentials that we'll get from assuming the role. And so let's try to run this modified workflow. So it's our fourth workflow, and that sort of malicious branch was called Shady3, and we're going to run it and see what happens. So that execution was also successful, and this was because of the misconfigured trust on the role, not because OIDC in itself has any kind of drawbacks. But we're still able to exfiltrate the credentials. And to fix this, we need to modify the role, and we need to modify the trust policy in the role. And we actually have two options here. One is to just specify in the condition on the subject claim that we only allow this role to be assumed from this specific branch, in this case, the main branch. And so if we try to use this role I called test GitHub Actions role 3, so if we try to use that, I'm going to show you quickly the kind of attack workflow. So that's the 3.1 branch. It's trying to assume that role 3 that is now fixed. And if we try to run it, it will ultimately fail. We'll give it another second. So the workflow is still running, but ultimately it's trying to assume the role but failing, and trying to retry it, and it will ultimately fail after a number of attempts. Now, the thing is, you can actually combine the environments and protections that the environments give you with the OIDC configurations. And what that looks like, and in fact, if you are using environments, you have to configure the trust policy in this way. So what that looks like is, in the trust policy configuration, I'm also now referring to the environment, GitHub environment, that is able to assume this role. And if the workflow is not using that environment, it's going to fail to assume the role. And so the modified workflow will look something like this. So in this case, this part is the same. I'm referring to that role 2, but I'm also using this production environment in the workflow definition. So if we try to now, we can try to attack this workflow using a workflow modified in the branch as well to exfiltrate the credentials. So now we're using that role 2. And if we run that, it's going to fail again. Let's see the result of that. So this failed again, and this failed because our environment protection rules basically prevented the run of this workflow on the unapproved, unprotected branch. Another thing that we could try to do is sort of trick the role assumption part and basically use the same workflow, but now I'm assuming the right role, but I've removed the reference to that environment and see if this trick is going to work. When we run that, it's going to fail again, but it's going to fail in a different way. So it's not going to give us an error here because of the environment protection rules, but it will basically time out trying to assume the role, because the role assumption is going to fail because of the role trust policy configuration. So let's quickly see that. So it's running. It's going to try to assume the role. I'm going to show you that it's kind of trying and retrying, and ultimately this process is going to fail, and the whole workflow is going to fail. And just to show you that one of the earlier ones that was trying multiple times has failed. All right. So to the conclusions. Security model of GitHub Actions secrets is not very intuitive, and ultimately you have to remember that anybody with right access to your repo has access to those secrets. My personal recommendation, never use them. We can use deployment environments or environments to further secure our secrets, and then you can use the protection rules on the environments as a security mechanism that controls access to the secrets. And you can actually combine that for both long-lived credentials and OIDC configurations and use basically your environments as the control mechanism that's going to be enforced across whether you use secrets or you use OIDC configurations, regardless of that scenario. One thing that kind of is part of the picture but I haven't covered in detail is that in a sense, it does matter what triggers are allowed on your workflows, because the trigger configuration always comes from your default branch, and whether you are allowed to execute the workflow or not at all depends on the triggers. In this case, I've used manual triggers, and that's partially why I was able to execute the workflows manually on any branch that I pick. But ultimately, the triggers matter, and I suggest that you review the triggers that you use and the workflows that they apply to kind of understand what can trigger those workflows. And ultimately, because of that kind of bait and switch, I can redefine the workflow in a new branch, whether that attack is possible at all, regardless of kind of secrets configuration and whatnot. And the last thing I'll mention, what I didn't cover is kind of specific scenarios specific to open source, where PRs are usually created from forks, not from the branches within the repository. There are some nuances there, and kind of the secret injection works slightly different for those PRs, and I didn't cover that at all, and it has some nuances. That's all I have for today. I have some additional reading material if you want to learn a little bit more about this topic. So that's the QR code on the left. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can scan the QR code on the right. And thanks for your attention.
Questions?
Great talk. What would you say the most effective log sources are for trying to detect these things, to see when someone's trying to steal your secrets?
I don't know a good answer to that question. One source is definitely workflow runs, because if you go into GitHub and you can see like previous runs, including the output that those runs had, but also including what branch the run was executed on. That may or may not be a good audit mechanism, because, and I don't know exactly what permissions are required, but you can delete past runs. And also I'm not sure what the retention is on the runs. I assume it's not forever. But that's one thing that you could check to see what, like, past runs, what the runs were executed on. I bet there's also some logs. I haven't looked into kind of audit logging within GitHub to see like what's exposed there, but my guess would be there's definitely something should be there.
I'll ask a question around environments. I haven't actually used them all that much, but like, what are the maybe downsides of using that? Or is it going to be, the recommendation is to use kind of environments, maybe other protections, like you mentioned OIDC restrictions and all that sort of stuff, branch protections. Where can environments maybe go wrong?
Yeah. I don't think there's any downsides to using environments. As far as I can tell, they can provide the same things as repository secrets. You can configure variables, you can configure secrets, both things, and you have the benefit of being able to control what has access to them. What those protections can be depend on your license. So for example, in GitHub Enterprise, you can configure basically manual approvals on any runs that use specific environments. And that's like, if that's what you want to do, you can do that. But at a minimum, it will allow you to basically repurpose your branch protection mechanisms and apply something that's already fairly well understood and kind of intuitive to a lot of engineers, apply similar mechanisms to your environment protections, and it ultimately, good understanding of what's happening within your repo configuration. I think like clear understanding is good for security always.
And so, sorry, to clarify that too, when you're using, for example, OIDC trust policy in AWS,
Yep.
you have to use environments basically everywhere, or like, can you use the environment restriction along with the branch like restriction, for example?
You can. I think like the way you're fairly flexible on the way how you configure the roles. So you can do both in the roles. What I meant when I said that you have to use environments is that if the workflow refers to an environment, that subject will always have environment and name, not the branch reference in the subject. So if you are using the environments, you have to have at least the statement or the condition in the trust policy that will kind of account for that and will refer to the environment as well.
Cool, thank you. All right, let's give it up.
All right, thank you.